It's here.
Got frozen.
Just come here. Would you like some tea or coffee?
The water's fine, thank
Water's
you.
fine. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, come. Leandra, do you want to?
Can you hear me?
Yes, can
Hi,
you
good
hear?
afternoon.
Anyway, I should start by apologising for being late. I'm very sorry.
Okay.
No,
Yeah.
no, it's fine.
Greetings from
It's a long
Pune,
hit.
from the Pune International Center.
Very, very good to see you. It's a long time since I've been in Pune, but I do know it's a very nice place. Yeah,
They all say that.
Not anymore. Yeah.
Okay,
because it's true, right?
Not anymore.
getting bad, and that's what we are all worried about.
Okay. Did you have any association with my great friend Mrinal Datta Chowdhury, who used to be in Pune?
Actually, I had met him a
Economist.
few times. Yes, I
Yeah.
knew. A very close friend of his is a close friend of mine.
Little louder.
Right. He was a very
Okay.
he was a very good friend. He was a very good friend for many years. Yeah.
All
Or
right.
many decades actually. Yeah.
Actually, a very good friend of his, R. Sudarshan. Do you know him? He's
Yeah.
a very dear friend
But
of mine.
not
That's
so-
how I met him.
Oh,
Yeah.
very good. Okay.
Okay.
Not like I knew Mrinal, but I've met him. Yeah. So what would
I
you
don't
like
know how
to
much
talk
time
about?
you have, but
They have an hour.
How much
All right,
time? I'm
so-
looking at my friends.
I think you have an hour.
Yeah.
all right. So we want
We can't see Niranjan. Is Niranjan joining?
No, it's fine. You don't need to see me. I'm just.
No, please come in.
Come on to that chair.
Come on, there's an empty chair.
Yeah. Come, you come here.
Very good.
All right. Good.
You've got this. He's got the second book on Palanpur. The third book on Palanpur has just come out. This is an Indian village I've been studying for 45 years now, and it's the third book. This is the second book that Nilanjan has got. But one of the things we're doing in India, we did it in Delhi. We released the book on Friday, and Manmohan Singh kindly released it, and then we're doing another release later this afternoon. So I have a sort of dual visit, partly Palanpur and partly climate, and partly Indian public policy, because we spent some time with the Finance Commission on Friday also.
Okay.
But would you like just to fire questions, or how would you like to do it?
Yeah, so if I may, I'll quickly introduce our team in Pune.
Yes, please.
And then we'll start off with the questions, and we'd greatly appreciate whatever you have to say on each of them, all of them, as time permits. Is that okay?
And absolutely, and we should have a discussion, yeah?
Yes. We'll keep time for a discussion. Okay. So, friends in Pune and friends, colleagues in Mumbai, it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Stern from LSE UK to the first PIC conversation event of 2019. We have started this series to engage global authorities across diverse fields with our Pune scholars, and we conduct the event through VC because traveling to Pune sometimes is challenging owing to time constraints. Nevertheless, our members and wider audience will greatly benefit from the interaction. So a brief introduction to our team seated here. To my left, Professor Amitav Malik, the PIC Honorary Trustee and Founder Member. He's a defense scientist, advisor, Envirotech, and he's been awarded the Padma Shri in 2002. And he's also the convener of the Climate Collective of Pune and a very active PIC member and the program committee chairperson. We have Mr. Madhukar Kotwal, PIC Life member. Mr. Kotwal has been a board member and president, Heavy Engineering L&T, and he is a fellow of the Indian Academy of Engineering and member of the EECC project. We have Ms. Sanskriti Menon from CCP. She's an environmental education and sustainability expert, and she's the program director at the Center for Environment Education, CEE India, and is actively engaged in the fields of environment awareness and public policy engagement. Next, we have Dr. Gurdas Nulkar. He is a professor, researcher, author, and ecologist with expertise in economics and environmental sustainability. He's senior faculty at Symbiosis International University and a trustee of the Ecological Society. Welcome, sir. We have Professor Anita Gokhale-Benninger. She's an urban planner and a renowned environmental activist. She is also the Executive Director and Professor of Sustainable Development at the Center for Development Studies and Activities, CDSA, in Pune. Next to my right, Dr. Priyadarshini Karve from CCP. She's an innovator, entrepreneur, advisor, working in sustainable development, climate-friendly lifestyle and waste management. She's a member of the Indian Network on Ethics and Climate Change and the CEO of Samuchit Envirotech. We have Ms. Purnima Agarkar, an RA with INECC and the Samuchit Envirotech. We have Mr. Ravindra Sinha from CCP. He's a groundwater expert and environmental activist. He's the co-founder of Mission Groundwater and BPLR Vikas Samiti. We have Ms. Vaishali Patkar. She's an independent HR professional, environmental activist and core member. She actively engages in citizens' movements for the past 15 years. We have our invaluable PIC team here, Aditi Kale, Research Associate, Akash Raj, Research Intern, Mithila Tupekar, our Social Innovation Project person and our technical expert at PIC, Sugandh Priya Ojha from the EECC project and a junior policy research analyst, and Tejas Pawar, who looks after our admin and logistics. We also welcome Mr. Ashwin Khatalia from Austin, Texas. He's visiting Pune and he started the Sister City initiative with us. And I am Shilpa Fadke. I am a PIC member and a consultant with the World Bank. So I'll hand over to Professor Malik and we can get started with the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you. Like Shilpa explained, in the PIC, Pune International Center, we are a small group of people that initiated the work on energy, environment and climate change. Last year we held a roundtable and various NGOs and experts joined us in this roundtable, and that was the beginning of what I thought I could try. We formed a Climate Collective Pune as a group of like-minded people, and we are working towards enhancing the climate awareness amongst the Pune citizen so that there could be some momentum for climate action. And we want to direct that, consolidate that climate action towards making Pune carbon neutral by 2030. And if that can happen, that would be a major achievement. The advantage of working collectively is that they are all experts with long years of expertise and experience in their own fields. But here under PIC, we have network kind of an approach where we can do bigger thing or larger time frame. Although my experience is security, defense, I changed track about 10 years ago. And the intention of this conversation today is to learn from you and your experience some of the indicators that we could follow for the kind of problems that we are facing in India and particularly in Pune. And as I shared with you, and I share it here for the convenience of everybody, we have a dichotomy in the sense we are at a transition phase where we are seeing a resurgence of solar and wind as renewable energy sources. Everybody is happy that it's picking up, and yet that is happening a bit too slow. And if we compare it to the investments that are still going for the oil and gas, thermal power, those investments are way higher than what is there for the renewable. If we look at the scenario, this practical scenario, in the context of IPCC latest report, there is a goal that mankind is supposed to become carbon neutral by 2050, and that looks like a very long shot. So it is in this context that I have posed the couple of questions, starting with the economic modeling which guides the whole policy dialogue. My observation is that in the economic models, very often the tipping points of the climate are missed, and then we assume that things will be linear, and then get surprised when things are. For instance, the IPCC predictions of climate change, the rate of change is already evidently actual rate is much faster than what we expected. So in this context, I was wondering, would you like to share your thoughts with us? Professor Stern.
Thank you very much. And I have real affinity with the main thrust of the question, because I think there's a big divergence between the economic modelling, particularly the integrated assessment models, and what the science is telling us. And there are three big reasons for that. The first is the one that you pointed to, which is that in those economic models, you really don't pick up the existential threats that the science models and the science theorizing are pointing us to. I mean, we haven't been at 3 degrees centigrade for 3 million years or so. At that temperature, the sea levels were several meters higher than now. Our life as Homo sapiens is around 250,000 years old, 250,000, and we haven't been at 3 degrees for 3 million. Our societies are really products of the Holocene period, the last 9,000-10,000 years, when temperatures have been plus or minus 1, and that was a very benign environment where grasses were turned into grains, and as they allowed us to have harvests, of course we had to wait for the harvest, so we had settlements, and we had surpluses, and we had storage, and essentially that gave us the civilization that we have today. I mean, if you have surpluses, you can have university professors. If you have storage, you don't have to go out hunting or gathering every day. So if you look at that time span, and then again ask about 3 degrees centigrade, it is way outside the experience of Homo sapiens and way outside the experience of the societies in which our civilizations have grown up. Probably many parts of the world would look like deserts, including southern Europe, look like the Sahara Desert, and other places would be underwater, and other places would be battered by hurricanes, and you'd see so much of the snows and glaciers going off from the Himalayas, which, you know, serve the Yangtze and the Yellow River and the Yangtze and the Mekong and the Ganges and the Yamuna and the Indus and so on. The big rivers come off the Himalayas, serving, you know, at least 2 billion people in those countries. And all that could change. You've got a very good climate group at Pune, and what they're telling us is, as you know better than I do, you're close by, is that the monsoon could change radically. And that, of course, has shaped the lives of those living in the Indo-Gangetic Plain. It's very close to my heart because the village I've been working in 45 years is right there in that area, not very far from the Ganges. So what we have is very powerful evidence that 3 degrees, and God forbid 4 or 5 degrees, would be extremely dangerous. Yet you have economic modelling that tells you, I'm thinking of, you know, the family of models associated with Bill Nordhaus, I mean, who's a friend and a scholar and a gentleman, but he's just got this stuff wrong. And, you know, at 4 or 5 degrees centigrade, they have 5-10% loss of GDP. I mean, imagine the whole world would be in havoc. Hundreds of millions, probably billions would have had to move. And you think, well, maybe that might be 5-10% loss in GDP. It's just unreal. And what they haven't done well enough is to use the very long run paleoclimate evidence. And they've depended very much on more recent evidence where, you've seen temperatures go up 0.6, 0.7 degrees centigrade, and it's exactly as you said. I mean, if you extrapolate that linearly, you don't get very much. But that's missing the point. I mean, the big evidence is looking back much further than that and seeing what the world was like when we were much warmer, of course, way beyond the period of Homo sapiens. So the first reason they get it wrong is that one, and it's enormously important. The second reason they get things wrong, and that's essentially the first reason, is a divergence between what the climate science is telling us and the economic modelling of the consequences and risks. The second reason is that they have costs of action which are way out of line, in my view, with the empirical evidence. Costs of action we now see are essentially full of discovery, full of economies of scale in building. I mean, just think solar, for example, but also very rapid and economies of scale, very rapid time paths and economies of scale in discovery itself. So when we published the Stern Review a dozen years or so ago now, that was 1 year before the iPhone. I mean, who would have thought that kind of digital management now of cities and energy systems that are available now were available when we didn't imagine what could be done. The cost of a solar panel has fallen by a factor of 10, 15. Around the world now, solar with storage is out-competing. You've seen it here in India with, just 2-3 rupees a unit is the kind of thing that you're seeing in these auctions, and it's out-competing fossil fuels, electricity generation. I mean, who would have thought that India would have set a target for 2030 of no further sales of electric vehicles? So if you look at transport, if you look at management of energy in urban systems, if you look at costs of renewables with storage, if you look at materials and the way in which we can make our buildings much more efficient than they had been before, what you have is a remarkable change just in a dozen years. Now, what the economic models build in is very rapidly increasing marginal costs as you take out more and more greenhouse gases from the production process.
Hello?
And so that's the second way in which they get it wrong, is that actually now we see, far from there being a cost of action, that the path to zero carbon is a very strong path of inclusive growth, full of discovery, innovation, investment, cities where you can move and breathe, and ecosystems which are robust and fruitful. So, and that was really the main subject matter of the report we published last year, Unlocking the Inclusive Growth Story of the 21st Century, and that was from the New Climate Economy, which I co-chair. You've probably seen it. Those of you who haven't can just go to www.thenewclimateeconomy.org. So the argument that we have to sacrifice a lot in order to be more responsible and clean, we have to sacrifice now in the next 10, 20 years, we now see is actually mistaken, and it's built into these models as cost curves for the reduction of greenhouse gases, which are not only devoid of the enormous technical progress we've seen, but actually have increasing marginal costs instead of, in large measure, what they should have is decreasing marginal costs. And the third way in which these models go wrong is their approach to discounting, which essentially is flies in the face of the basic theory of why it is that you discount. And in my book, Why Are We Waiting? It was MIT Press 2015, I went into this in some detail, a bit more detail than in the Stern Review, but from the same spirit. But essentially, keeping it as simple as possible, the discounting that you do comes from two sources. One is if you think that future generations will be much richer than ours, so an extra unit of output for them you'd mark down because they're very much richer. If they are, of course, that's the hypothesis which one has to question. And second is essentially discrimination by date of birth, where you value a life which is otherwise identical to a life that is there now at a lower level simply because it is in the future. And that is discrimination by date of birth, which I think most ethical constructs would find unacceptable. It's not there for voting, it's not there in front of the law. In fact, it's completely devoid of any ethical argument as to why you would do it. So it comes back really from the point of view of discounting to whether or not you think future generations will be much better off than us. Well, if we don't manage climate change for the reasons we've just been discussing, then they will not.
No.
So what that's telling us in the boring language of modelling is that the discounting is endogenous. In other words, it depends on what we do. It can't be imported from outside the model. So the big mistakes that economists have made is they've not really understood the theory of discounting, and they've not understood the basic ethics, and they haven't understood the basic risks that are involved, which could make, with unmanaged climate change, future generations much worse off than we are. So if you put those three mistakes together, you get results which Nordhaus and others have argued, essentially of optimum stable temperature of 3.5 or 4 degrees centigrade, which is total madness. But you can see where it comes from. You can see where it comes from, and if you drop actually any one of these assumptions, it makes a big difference. If you drop all three of them, then you get results which the world has recognized as sane in the Paris Agreement and well below 2 degrees. If the world took those economic models seriously, they wouldn't have come to that conclusion. And fortunately, they didn't. And they did come to that conclusion.
Yeah.
And
would you like to
Yeah, please go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, what is the credibility of the tipping points that the scientists are now talking about so seriously? What is the field there?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not a climate scientist. I'm a consumer of climate science, and I have friends who are very, very distinguished climate scientists, and I look to them for their guidance. But if you think about, for example, one of those tipping points, which is the thawing of the permafrost and release of methane, that's something which could happen very quickly in geological time, i.e. in a few decades. That's perfectly possible. The collapse of the Amazon, we don't know under what circumstances that would happen, but that could be at 2 or 3 degrees centigrade or even less. Well, the collapse of the Amazon forest would have a dramatic effect, which would be a tipping point in the sense that it'd be a positive, like the melting of the permafrost, it's a positive feedback, and you get essentially systems that run away. If you think of the melting of the ice sheets, again, that's quite strong positive feedback, because you lose the white cover, and so you absorb more heat. So those are three examples of potentially very major positive feedbacks, and if you have those positive feedbacks in the system, then you can indeed have tipping points which essentially bring you, runaway effects and likely things which are essentially irreversible. You have to be careful with your use of language of tipping points, but I normally understand them in terms of very strong positive feedbacks and effects that are irreversible. And those examples are there, and they're deeply worrying. And we don't quite know where they are. I mean, if it's big difference, if it's 1.5 or 2.5. And if it's 1.5, we run into them probably in 30 years or so.
Would you like to comment on a couple of other points that are there?
Which point, sorry?
No,
I tried to answer your first question and your second question, but
okay.
First question was about the modelling and second question about tipping points.
All right. In terms of creating awareness and people's movement, I think it is the younger generation that is becoming alert They are asking for change. They are asking for their government to be accountable. Do you see this momentum gathering very quickly and actually things happening through the younger people? Ultimately, governments will have to listen to them. Your views, if you have.
Well, my first reaction is I really hope so. Last Friday in Europe we had strikes of school children, which I found enormously positive and cheerful. I'm not sure their teachers did, but never mind. And in universities, you see really our students feeling quite strongly about these issues, and they make choices. Of course, if you ask what they can do, well, they can behave differently themselves, and more of them are. I mean, they're looking to reduce waste across the board. They use public transport. They are less likely to own their own cars than previous generations. They're changing their diets, many of them, and eating much less meat. So if you look at diet and transport and waste, and we encourage them also to think very hard about where they put their pensions. I mean, do you want to put your pension, which you hope pays off 30 or 40 years from now, hoping we've managed the world well, do you want to put it in the technologies of the 19th century or the 21st century? It seems to me much less risky to put them in the technologies of the 21st century, even if you're thinking of it narrowly from the point of view of what your pension is going to pay out for you. And of course you have to hold the politicians' feet to the fire, if you excuse the metaphor. And so there's a lot that students can do as well as being active politically. I mean, students and young people more generally. But the accusation that you don't understand and you've messed it up, it seems to me more like fair comment than an accusation. So the more they do it, the better, in my view. Oh, they of course choose where to work. I should have emphasised that as well. And many of them want to work for responsible firms and not for irresponsible firms, which means the more responsible firms get better people. So there are various ways in which that pressure comes through, as consumers, as savers, as employees, and as political citizens. I was actually cheering up because I ran into some of that in India too over these last few days.
Yes.
But your basic question, will all that give us the acceleration we need? I'm seriously worried about that. I'm enormously optimistic about what we can do, but seriously worried about...
I'm trying to define the we. Yeah, we are all seriously optimistic about what we can do. I'm trying to zero down who is that we.
Oh, we is... I meant we as a world.
It has to be the younger people. It has to be the younger people. Yeah.
Well, you know, if somebody, I've no idea how old you are, but, you know, anybody who is 40, 50, 60 is going to be around long enough to make a very big difference to this.
Yeah.
The next 20 years are absolutely decisive. I mean, the world economy grows by a factor of 2, roughly speaking. Infrastructure probably by a bit more than 2 in those 2 decades. And we have to cut emissions, even with the well below 2 degree, let alone the 1.5, we have to cut emissions by about 40% or more. So double the world economy and at the same time cut emissions by 40%. Even if this new economy had 0 emissions, that wouldn't be enough. Yeah? Because you've got to cut absolutely by 40%. So it's ourselves, all of us. I mean, you might let 1 or 2 people of 90 off the hook, but otherwise I'd include everybody.
Professor, what do you make of the Green New Deal? Is that more political noise at the moment, or is it an ambitious plan?
Yeah, the trouble is that a Green New Deal, people mean all sorts of things. And basically... That's
the US initiative, Green New Deal.
Did you hear the question?
Yeah, we got
the question.
Yeah,
Sorry?
we got the question.
Yes, we got it.
Okay. So my view is that the Green New Deal is essentially all the things that we're talking about. It's a much more efficient economy with much less waste than the circular economy. It's power that's totally zero carbon. It's transport that's zero carbon. Well, either electricity run on zero carbon, either electric vehicles run on zero carbon electricity, or hydrogen or ammonia or something made in a zero carbon way. So I'd look across the whole thing. It's looking after our forests and land much better. So when people talk about the new Green Deal, I think we're talking about all the things that are on our agenda, which means every aspect of what we do, whether it's energy or transport or buildings or cement or steel or agriculture and land use and forests. It's the whole lot. And if that's what you mean by the Green Deal, then fine. That's what I mean. And so I'm wholly with it.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. That's one.
No, the development agenda.
Okay. We have a concern about the shrinking budget, the carbon budget, and I would request Dr. Priyadarshini to speak about it.
This is a conflict that keeps on happening in the Indian context. That we are a developing country, we are still investing in creating new infrastructure. There is a lot of justification given for that. And on the other hand, now if we are talking about 1.5 degrees centigrade as the cap for the end of this century, the total carbon budget available over the remaining period has shrunk. How do we then plan our development strategy as a country and continue on the trajectory of meeting the aspirations of Indian citizens? That's a question that keeps on cropping up whenever we are talking about going low carbon in India. And a related question to that then is also related to defining who this we is. Who has the greater responsibility then? That with this shrunk budget, who should get the higher piece of that? Or is it really fair to divide it equally among all countries? I mean, what are your thoughts on these issues?
Yeah, I think the first question is simply misplaced. The drive to the zero carbon economy is the inclusive growth story of this century. In other words, I would absolutely reject the idea that there's some kind of horse race between development on one side and climate and environmental responsibility on the other. And what we're seeing now...
My question is, what arguments do we use in countering...
I've just been trying to set them out. I mean, much of what we do will be around efficiency and not wasting, whether it's energy or food or clothing or whatever it might be. And that's very good for development. We're seeing that renewables now are cheaper in many parts of the world, including in India and including storage, than fossil fuels for the generation of electricity. As we make those investments and switch to electric vehicles, the electric vehicle is far more efficient than the internal combustion engine vehicle, far more. I mean, why do you have a radiator in a car? It's because you're trying to get rid of heat that you've generated that you don't want to use. There are far more moving parts in an internal combustion engine. They're estimating now, some figures from Volkswagen, it takes them 25 person days to make an internal combustion engine car. They reckon quite soon they'll be able to make an electric car in 10 person days. So in the production and in the use, the internal combustion engine is just totally outdated. I mean, it is deeply inefficient. So if you look at waste, if you look at power, if you look at transport, if you look at forests and our natural infrastructure, destroying our natural infrastructure is not a route to development. It's a route to going backwards. So I think you have to set out the arguments and show what's possible. Cities where you can't move and breathe are deeply destructive to health and not productive places to be. So I think we have to go through these things and we can show what we're saying. So the argument that there's some kind of horse race or spitting contest between development on the one hand and environmental and climate responsibility on the other, we have to dispose of very vigorously because it's straight wrong. Now, on the question of we, it's certainly the case that the rich countries got rich on fossil fuel development. So the next question is what follows from that. Yeah? And essentially justice, if you look at the way in which people like Amartya Sen write, I mean, he's got a very good book on the idea of justice, or, you know, basically the idea of justice across the board is best defined, in my view, through injustice, and injustice is an entitlement or a right denied. So the question is, then shifts to what are rights or entitlements. And then you have to try to make arguments, I think, based on the notion of our equality as human beings. So it seems to me you can assert a right to development, but I don't see you can assert a right to emit. You know, on what ethical foundation is there a right to emit? Emissions damage other people. Indeed, they kill other people down the track. Where is the right to do that? So our challenge then is to take into account historical responsibility, take into account the challenges of development, and then ask what follows from that. And in my view, what follows from that is that rich countries have a very big responsibility to cut their own emissions and their own waste, that they have a responsibility to help other people find a path to development which is much less damaging than the path that they followed. And that is, of course, in the interests of those countries. It's madness to produce, you know, India's produced a way of developing where the 10 most polluted cities in the world are all in India. That can't be a good idea. It can't be conducive to development. It's actually the other way around. Of course, the challenge is how to change, and how to change quickly. And there, it seems to me, there's an obligation for those who are richer, particularly given their pasts, to help with that, with technologies, with finance, and so on. So that's the we. But if you look at the numbers, probably around 2/3 of the emissions now come from emerging markets and developing countries. Well, if the rich countries went to naught tomorrow, which of course they would not do, but even if they did, you can see the problem of cutting our emissions by 40% in the next 20 years is everybody's problem. And the challenge then of the we is that we must all cut emissions, and those who are better off, those who are more responsible in the past, those who've got better technology, have an obligation to share the technologies and share the finance. But I see absolutely no ethical or any other content in asserting the right to emit. And that's where the carving up of the space argument just seems to me to go badly wrong ethically and economically. I had a great friend, Meles Zenawi, who negotiated for Africa in Copenhagen and afterwards, and I had no official position, but I was a friend who would go back and forth with the rich countries. And I remember I was on a panel, I was the only non-African on the panel in Durban in COP17, 2 years after Copenhagen. And Meles, I thought, expressed it very well. He said he could not see any argument associated with justice which said that because other people fouled the planet in the past, we have a right to foul the planet now. That was his language, but it expresses in sort of more direct, pithy way the kind of arguments I'm trying to offer. And they're arguments about how you support inclusive development. They're not they're complete opposite of any attempt to deny anybody the right to development. And I would suggest that there is a right to development because we all share in the world and we all have some kind of equality as human beings, and that's concerned with our aspirations and our ability to make our lives better. And it seems to me we are equal in that respect. But other people with their history and their wealth have an obligation to help.
Sure. On the topic of cities, given that the rate of urbanization in India is pretty high and likely to increase, but that cities remain relatively powerless in terms of governance and finance, what would you say is the relative importance of mitigation action by cities in India, by cities or in cities in India, versus, say, action by the national government or by state governments? I mean, to what extent should cities take this mantle on?
Well, it's a very important question. I think you can't delegate this responsibility or allocate this responsibility to any one tier of government. I mean, it's something that runs right through all our lives. Already something like 70-75% of the world's production and 70-75% of the world's emissions are in cities. Currently just over 50% of the population is in cities, and probably by mid-century that'll go up to something like 70%. And if the population moves from 7.5 up to 9.5, then you're going to get the population in cities moving from 3.5-4 billion up to over 7 billion in the next 35 years. So you can see just from looking at those numbers, most of this action is actually in cities. If 70-some% of the emissions are associated one way or the other with infrastructure, and 70% or so of the infrastructure that's coming in this next 15 or 20 years will be in emerging markets and developing countries. Well, if you multiply 0.7 by 0.7, you get roughly a half. That's saying half the problem is in sustainable infrastructure in emerging markets and developing countries, and the big bulk of that, of course, will be in cities. So it's absolutely unavoidable that that's where the action will take place. So then the question is, well, how do you get together cities, states and national government to make that action as effective as possible? Now, there's some things that cities can better do themselves based on the local knowledge of how they function. I mean, their internal transport systems, congestion charging, public transport and so on, are probably best organised at the city level. But we know, of course, that a lot of the financing around that is going to come from state and national levels. But I think it would be good, and this applies to cities around the world, if there was much stronger own sources of finance. And basically, if you think of the public finance side of this, the own sources of finance could be congestion charges. The own sources of finance could be property taxation. But also, I think there's great scope for piggybacking on national taxes, so piggybacking on income taxes. But as a principle of public finance, you'd want the tax revenues to either have separate bases or completely overlapping bases with piggybacking on the rates. Then you can't discuss what cities can do without talking about public finance and the generation of revenues and the allocation of responsibilities. But we know that, a lot of the metro story would be funded with some combination of cities and states, because often those lines are not just within cities, but they stretch out further and so on. I hope that the 15th Finance Commission will have something to say on these issues, and I would be surprised if they didn't, knowing some of the people sitting on that commission.
Thank you for that. I have a very fundamental question which I would like to ask, at the risk of sounding really naive. My question is, how much longer do you think we can keep coaxing each other at the Conference of Parties to do better for climate change? At what point must we invoke the precautionary principle and all of us say that this is the list of industries which we must stop. These are the ones which are frivolously intensive energy carbon emitters, and here's a list, and what can we do about it?
There's a difference between frustration and practical action, and I share the same frustration that you do, but what we've got to do is find policies that are going to work. If there was a police force from Mars and a court system from Jupiter, then we might think of having rigorously enforceable legal structures, which if you transgress, then you're locked up or sent to Mars or Jupiter or whatever. But obviously I'm putting it in a way that suggests that I don't really think that's possible. And I was very struck, and it was actually a breakthrough, I thought, in Paris, to say, look, we do realize that there's no strong enforcement mechanism. What matters here is our collective understanding of the problem and our vision that there's a way forward which is actually better for all of us. And indeed, even if we don't know very much about climate change, it's still better for us, along the lines of the arguments we were discussing earlier about routes to development. So I think the bottom-up approach, where we act together and share, has been shown actually to be the one that works the best. Is it perfect? Of course not. Is it enforceable? No, it isn't. But is it delivering? I think it's beginning to deliver. Now, if you look at the challenge, as you put it, which I think is a very reasonable one, of focusing on some of the most destructive industries, there I think we have quite a lot of instruments that we can use. If we as savers say we do not want our institutional investors, our pension funds, our insurance companies to put money in dangerous, risky activities, particularly fossil fuel related activities, we can say that to them. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which was initiated from the Financial Stability Board, which is, some respects, a rather tedious and boring international financial structure under the Bank for International Settlements, they have argued, and it was Mark Carney who was then the chair of that, who initiated it, and he asked Mike Bloomberg to construct reporting mechanisms so that financial institutions had a duty to say how much of their portfolio was in industries which are essentially very risky and that they would not survive serious public policy on climate change. And if you look at, I'll give an example from one bank that I know, HSBC, their default option in the defined contribution pension scheme is the Legal and General Future Fund, which is a fund that's supposed to be investing in cleaner, greener, more sustainable technologies. So actually we are not without weapons here. And I think that the financial institutions and what they do in the interests of the people who put their money with them could be very powerful. And it is actually already producing results where, for example, Shell late last year were forced into revealing their own emissions on a much more frequent and nearer term. And that was in part the university superannuation scheme, where my pension is. I'm not unique in this, of course. And the Church of England, with the monies that they invest. But that's happening much more now. So I think the financial sector is a very powerful way. And that's something which I haven't seen very much yet in India. But you have big pension funds, right? We're sitting here in HDFC, and it would be very interesting to put pressure on them so that they conform to the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, and they tell the people who've got the money with them where they're putting it and just how risky it is if they're investing, as I say, in 19th century technologies rather than 21st. A tax on coal, you need quite a modest tax on coal to see it right out of the system. And we should do exactly that. Now, India's begun, still very small. Put up the tax on coal. The revenue come in handy for a while. Of course, you hope very soon the revenue goes away because you're not using so much coal anymore.
Unfortunately, most of the power companies in India are right down under with huge non-performing loans anyway.
Yeah, but they
Right,
are...
India, all over the world, it is the same thing.
Yeah, but you don't change the reality by claiming that you're in a bad financial state. Because what do? Do you use stuff that's more expensive? So I'm in a bad place, so I'm going to go on using stuff that's more expensive? Doesn't make any sense, right? So it's not that you don't understand the problem. The only way out of it is to face reality, that this is a very costly and damaging activity. And if you don't,
This is all right.
it's in bankruptcy, the earlier you face up to it, the better.
Perhaps this is the right time to address the problem of not being able to do anything about the carbon tax. Everybody understands that that's the way we can actually make a difference. And yet there is no will, general public will, to go for the carbon tax. Yes, there is a movement about shifting investments to the from the common people to pension funds and all, but the carbon tax would be a more definite manner in which the cost of doing wrong can be compensated, can be saved, and the benefit given to the common people. But then who will bell the cat? That's a kind of a problem.
Yeah. You're in danger of talking yourself into deep gloom when it's our job is to find ways of doing things. Roughly 15% of the emissions around the world are subject to some form of carbon market or carbon tax. 10 years ago, you couldn't have made 1.5. 15.
Yeah.
Now, 10 years ago, it would have been extremely small. But I don't want to get wildly optimistic, but India could raise the tax on coal. China's moving to carbon market. In the European Union, we've just begun to rescue the emissions trading scheme by the simple device of dishing out less permits and watching the price go up. You don't have to be a professor of economics at the LSE to work that one out. And so it's not all bad in that direction. But at the same time, we have to recognize two things. One is that because of the sense of direction, we've seen very rapid technical progress in the alternative technologies, which means that actually even without a carbon price, you're seeing in the recent auctions in India for power, the fossil fuels didn't get a look in, because even without a carbon price, they're not competitive anymore. So that part of the story is very important. The second part of the story is regulation. Now, the statement that you can't sell an internal combustion engine new car in India after 2030 is a very powerful piece of regulation. And that's the kind of thing that it may well be possible to push through. In Europe, you've taken this much further, but in Europe we banned the incandescent light bulb. And the LED light bulbs came through very quickly. And now in India, you've absolutely crashed the price of the LED by going very big in government purchasing schemes and economies of scale. So through procurement, through regulation, through technical progress, there's a great deal we can do. And at the same time, we should be pushing up on the carbon tax where we can, in particular using revenue to look after poorer people or the people who've been dislocated in the change of economic structure associated with moving out of fossil fuels.
Yes, I agree.
Sorry, Professor Malik, it's like we just have another 5 minutes or so, because
Sure.
We need to leave.
Yeah, okay. All right. So anyway, I was actually talking about carbon tax at the production end, not at the consumer end. So, but we
I
need
think
to
it's quite a good idea. It's quite a good idea if you're collecting a carbon tax to do it around coal and oil and gas. You get most of it that way.
Well, since we are running short of time, I'll hand over to Shilpa and let's see how we can close up.
Yeah. Professor, if I may ask one last question. For economies like India and similar economies which have a vast rural-urban divide in terms of productivity, production, emissions, and so on, what are some key messages that you would give policymakers here? Do we address the economy and the climate differently, say, in Palanpur versus Pune?
Well, different activities are affected in different ways, and obviously issues around agriculture and water are particularly important in village India, and something like 85% of India's water is used in agriculture. So the efficient use of water would be a very important part of the process. You're seeing, and many of you are involved directly in these kinds of areas, you're seeing falling water tables, and you're seeing the destruction of soil quality, and you're seeing encroachment on forests. So all of those things are very strongly related with climate activities or climate relevant activities, and more efficient use of water saves energy and gives you better productivity, and there you've got lower emissions as a result. So the areas where you would focus would look a bit different. Obviously, city public transport systems look a bit different from rural buses. But, you can make them both electric or hydrogen. But the design of a metro system wouldn't be relevant for Palanpur. So it depends on the activities. But basically, some activities will overlap, like electric buses, and some activities will overlap less. So a country which has much more, as it were, rural population, we don't have so many forests left in the UK, but you've still got some decent forests, even if you're giving them a bad time. And that's something which I think would be enormously important. And as someone who loves riding around in parks in India, there's a huge tourist potential there that you're not tapping properly, that you'd get if you looked after the forests better, and revenues then can go to local populations and so on. So I think your economic structure and your asset structure, the forests and so on are great assets. Your economic structure and your asset structure mean that you're going to focus in different places. But things like zero carbon electricity, things like zero carbon transport, things like cutting out waste. I mean, we as a world throw away something like 35% or so of our food. In developing countries, it's mostly after the harvest and before it gets to the market. And in rich countries, it's between the market and the table and the trash bin. But so that acting on food waste is common to both countries, but both sets of countries. But the way you act on food waste will be different in different places. But I think the spirit of, efficiency, care over natural assets, going zero carbon right across the economy, that kind of, at that level, they're the same, but at the application of particular areas and activities, then they look a bit different.
Yes.
Yep.
Thank you. So Niranjan, do I have a couple of minutes to close?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Any further comments from your side?
Let me also say thank you from our side. I thought at the end I would just want to share that we are particularly worried about the tipping points because we have a whole of Himalayan glacier that can change everything for not just economy but the very survival of our nation. So we would look forward to getting little more input in terms of not the physics of the tipping point, but the political will to understand the consequences of tipping point and therefore accelerating the climate action. So I think you are in a different.
Yeah, I hope I'm not an idealist, but I've worked for 45 years in India and 30 years in China, and living in both places for extended periods. And I've not lived in Pakistan, but I've worked there from time to time.
So
and it's those three countries, plus Bangladesh and Southeast Asia, which are most affected by the problem that you describe. So wouldn't it be a good idea if they got together around, you get people together around common purpose, about a shared threat. So all the time we start thinking about each other, we could also think about the collective. And that's something that, real leadership could generate. Of course, we must be careful because it's the emissions of the whole world that are attacking the Himalayas, so it's a shared responsibility as well. But it's the countries that are there that can draw attention most strongly to the magnitude. It's just enormous, that one. And that's something where changing the politics would be tremendous. Remember that political will is a renewable resource.
Yeah. On that note, I think we will close this very, very rich round of discussions. I want to say a big thank you to Professor Stern and to Dr. Ruth for speaking with us. We know it's been a very hectic few days in India, and we really appreciate getting your insights on all of these topics that we've been discussing for the past hour or so. I want to thank Anjali Tarapur and her wonderful team at HDFC for offering the VC facility, especially on a holiday. We really appreciate it, Anjali. Thank you. Niranjan, equal thanks to you for coordinating the logistics, for bringing PIC and Professor Stern together on this platform. And in Pune, we extend our thanks to our MCCI friends and colleagues. We have a representative from the IT team who's worked very hard to make this possible. We also thank the PIC director, who's also with MCCI, Prashant Girbane, for providing the venue and for organizing this event. And last but not the least, our PIC colleagues deserve a special mention for their tireless efforts and for ensuring that the event went off without a glitch. I must not forget Dr. Vijay Kerkar, who actually initiated the first contact with Professor Stern, and along with Professor Malik, who's provided us tremendous guidance along the way and bringing us, to the talking table, as it were. So thank you very much to all the participants as well for coming out here and engaging with Professor Stern. And Professor, we wish you a very pleasant evening, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon. Safe travels back home.
Thank you, Shilpa. Thank you, Professor Malik. Thanks to everybody. Could you give my dear friend Vijay Kelkar a big hug on my behalf? He's a very old friend, and so when he sent me an email, what could I do? I had to agree.
And we are very grateful you did.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks.
conference recording has started.